I want you to picture October 16th, 1983.
Oh, the rollout.
Yeah, exactly. You are standing out in Palmdale, California, and the crowd around you is just buzzing with this almost electric anticipation.
Right.
NASA is rolling out its newest space shuttle, Discovery. And it is this gleaming, impossibly complex pinnacle of human engineering.
Millions of interlocking parts.
Millions, all designed to endure the vacuum of space and the brutal heat of atmospheric reentry. But, and here's the thing, if you look past the ceramic heat shields and the rocket boosters, the name painted on the side of that orbiter carries a history that most people completely misunderstand.
They really do. People assume these shuttle names are just engineered in a boardroom somewhere to sound majestic.
Exactly. But the truth is, the lineage of that specific name traces back to a completely different era of exploration and an entirely different kind of vehicle.
Yeah, the contrast between the aesthetic of a space shuttle and the reality of its namesake is just staggering.
It's wild. So today we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of sources. We've got NASA's internal archives, deep-cut maritime history journals.
Some amazing natural history museum records, too.
Right, and the meticulously detailed logs from the Captain Cook Society. And what those documents reveal is a story of profound transformation. We are looking at the original HMS Discovery, which was launched in 1774.
The original one, yes.
So our mission for this deep dive is to trace the life cycle of that specific vessel. We're going to unpack how a genuinely humble, grime-soaked, coal-hauling ship became basically a floating multidisciplinary laboratory.
A literal scientific powerhouse.
Yeah. We'll examine the structural and political mechanics that allowed it to survive the Arctic ice, how it became the epicenter of one of the most infamous tragedies in maritime history, and why its specific legacy was chosen to represent humanity's leap into the cosmos.
To really understand that legacy, though, we have to start with its physical origins, because they defy every conventional assumption you might have about exploration vessels.
Oh, absolutely.
When we think of a ship chosen by the British Admiralty for a multi-year global expedition, we picture this sleek, purpose-built marvel of naval architecture.
Like a sports car of the sea.
Right. But the 1774 Discovery was the exact antithesis of that. It was built in Whitby in the northeast of England by these builders, G&N Langborn, for a private owner named William Herbert.
And its original name wasn't even Discovery, right?
No, it was originally named the Diligence, and it was classified as a Whitby Cat.
Which is a very specific type of collier. And for those who follow naval architecture, a collier is designed for one incredibly unglamorous purpose.
Hauling coal.
Hauling massive, dirty loads of coal down the treacherous North Sea coast to London. So the design parameters for a Whitby Cat are entirely dictated by that cargo and that route.
They had flat-bottomed hulls, extremely bluff, which just means wide and blunt bows, and a very shallow draft.
Right. And the Admiralty purchased this vessel for 2,415 pounds?
Exactly. And at just 299 tons, it was actually the absolute smallest ship James Cook ever took to the Pacific.
Which brings up a great analogy. For you listening, it's like planning a highly complex, multi-year expedition to the edge of the known world and choosing to drive a sturdy, flat-bottomed commercial moving van instead of a sleek, high-speed sports car.
It sounds counterintuitive. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategic genius behind choosing a moving van over a naval warship comes down to the physics of coastal navigation in unmapped waters.
Right, because standard warships of the era were built for speed and stability under heavy cannon fire.
Exactly, which required a deep V-shaped hull that cuts sharply into the water. But the problem with a deep draft is if you strike an uncharted reef or a hidden sandbar, that V-shape becomes a fatal liability.
Oh yeah, the ship just tips over.
It tips over, the masts snap under the structural stress, and the whole vessel breaks apart.
But a flat-bottomed Whitby Cat operates on a completely different physical principle.
Yeah, its shallow draft means it displaces water over a much wider, flatter surface area.
So if you run a Whitby Cat aground on an unknown coastline, it doesn't tip. It literally just sits upright on the sand.
It just parks there.
Yeah. The crew can just wait for the tide to recede, casually step out onto the beach to patch the hull, and then float off safely when the tide returns.
It turns a catastrophic shipwreck into a routine maintenance stop. And Cook himself actually recognized the superior survivability of this design.
He wrote about it in his logs, didn't he?
He did. He highlighted that the Discovery was remarkably adept at clawing off a lee shore.
Which is crucial in a heavy gale.
Exactly. When the wind is actively trying to drive a ship onto coastal rocks, the Discovery's specific weight distribution allowed it to maintain forward momentum and angle away from destruction far better than his much larger flagship, the Resolution.
Even so, the Navy still had to militarize and prepare it for a multi-year voyage. It wasn't quite ready as a coal ship.
Right. They took the original two-masted brig configuration and modified it into a three-masted, full-rigged ship.
Just to maximize maneuverability in shifting global wind patterns.
But the most vital engineering modification they made was the decision to double the hull.
Oh, the sacrificial layer.
Yeah, they added a second layer of exterior wood planking. And this wasn't just for impact resistance, it was actually a biological defense mechanism.
Because they're engineering a defense against Teredo nivalis. Right, the naval shipworm.
Yes, which are actually a species of saltwater clam that bore into submerged wood.
They are terrifying. They basically use the rough edges of their shells to rasp away at the timber.
Effectively honeycombing a ship's hull from the inside out.
Until the structural integrity just completely collapses.
Exactly. And in the warm waters of the Pacific, a standard single-planked hull could be decimated in months. So by adding that sacrificial outer layer, the Admiralty bought the Discovery the time it needed to survive those tropical ecosystems.
So, okay, by the summer of 1776, the physical vehicle is optimized and ready to go. But the command structure was falling apart in just a spectacularly bizarre way.
Oh, it was a mess.
The Admiralty had appointed Captain Charles Clerke to command the Discovery. And Clerke was, a highly respected veteran of Cook's first two circumnavigations.
He had the exact mix of navigational expertise and leadership they needed.
Right. Yet, when Cook and the Resolution sailed from Plymouth on July 12th, 1776, Clerke was missing.
He wasn't there.
He was locked in the King's Bench debtors' prison in London.
Yeah, and the circumstances of that imprisonment highlight a fascinating intersection of 18th century law and social obligation. Because Clerke hadn't even accrued the debt himself.
He had legally stood as a guarantor for his brother. Okay.
Exactly. And when his brother fled to the East Indies, the legal liability transferred entirely to Clerke.
Okay, I have to challenge the logic of the British government here. Wait, the British Navy is launching the most ambitious, scientific, and diplomatic voyage of the era, and they just leave their second-in-command rotting in prison over someone else's debt. How does that make sense?
Well, what's fascinating here is that it reveals the absolute supremacy of civil property law in 18th century Britain.
Even over the Navy.
Even over the Admiralty. Debt was this sacred legal boundary that the military did not have the jurisdiction to unilaterally dismiss.
Wow.
Furthermore, Clerke's creditors were highly motivated. They knew he was about to leave the jurisdiction for several years on a highly dangerous voyage.
So locking him up was their only leverage.
Exactly. To ensure the debt was settled, the Admiralty couldn't just break him out. They had to engage in weeks of intense, grinding legal negotiations.
Which structurally altered the launch of the entire expedition. The ship suffered a staggered start. Clerke wasn't released until mid-August.
Forcing the Discovery to play this massive game of catch-up.
Right. They finally reunited with Cook's flagship all the way down at the Cape of Good Hope. But the logistical delay is vastly overshadowed by the biological costs of that imprisonment.
Because King's Bench Prison was notorious for its damp, overcrowded, and severely unsanitary conditions, it was the perfect breeding ground for infectious disease.
And that's where Clerke contracted tuberculosis.
Yeah, during those weeks of confinement. And we really have to consider the psychological and physical burden of this.
He assumes command of a grueling global expedition, knowing he has contracted a disease that, back then, was a slow, inevitable death sentence.
He spent the next 3 years commanding a vessel through some of the most extreme environments on Earth, while his lungs were slowly failing.
It frames his entire command in a deeply tragic light. He essentially sacrificed his life for the voyage before he ever stepped foot on the Discovery.
He really did. And despite that compromised start, once the Discovery joined the Resolution, the vessel underwent its most significant transformation.
Right. It ceased to be a coal hauler and basically operated as a highly concentrated, mobile scientific institution.
Because the parameters of their mission were incredibly complex. Officially, on the surface, the diplomatic objective was to return a Polynesian man named Omai to his homeland.
But the classified objective, the real reason the government funded the voyage, was the search for the Northwest Passage.
Yes, They were tasked with finding a navigable waterway across the top of North America that would connect the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans.
Which would have completely revolutionized global trade.
Absolutely. But executing that mission required a staggering amount of resources packed into a microscopic footprint. I mean, the Discovery was less than 100 feet long.
Less than 100 feet. And into that space, they crammed a complement of 70 men, provisions for years, and a massive menagerie of livestock.
The logs detail sheep, cattle, hogs.
And even a peacock from the king's farm.
A peacock, yes. The spatial management alone, balancing the shifting weight of the livestock, the provisions, and the scientific equipment, was a daily engineering feat.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If you think about it, it's the 18th century equivalent of the International Space Station.
That's a great way to put it.
It's this cramped, multidisciplinary floating lab operating in a hostile environment. And the scientific yield from this was unprecedented, largely due to the specific personnel on board.
Like the surgeon, William Anderson, and the botanist, David Nelson.
Right. They were utilizing the ship's mobility to conduct real-time ecological problem solving.
And their work in the subantarctic provides a perfect example of this applied science. When they anchored at the Kerguelen Islands, they didn't just catalog flora for the sake of royal archives.
They aggressively sought local botanical solutions to maritime problems.
Exactly. They harvested large quantities of what became known as Kerguelen cabbage,
which addresses the absolute greatest biological threat to any long-term voyage scurvy.
the dreaded scurvy.
Today, we understand scurvy is caused by a severe deficiency in ascorbic acid, or vitamin C. Without it, the human body literally stops synthesizing collagen.
The connective tissues just begin to break down.
Yeah, old wounds reopen, capillaries rupture, it's gruesome.
The crew obviously wouldn't have understood the molecular biology of collagen synthesis, but Anderson and Nelson observed the empirical results.
They knew that introducing specific, fresh, localized flora into the crew's diet halted the physical breakdown.
That is the essence of field ecology. And as the Discovery pushed into the Pacific, that botanical documentation expanded exponentially.
They were conducting some of the very first European scientific analyses of indigenous Pacific plant life.
They documented the Hawaiian kukui nut,
Isolating the fact that its exceptionally high oil content allowed it to be utilized by locals as a sustained candle or light source.
They also analyzed kava and its specific applications in ceremonial contexts.
And cataloged New Zealand's manuka.
And again, the flat-bottom design of the Discovery allowed it to access those shallow coastal ecosystems that heavier ships could never reach.
Turning every single sandbar into a data collection point.
Exactly.
But the physical design that allowed them to glide over tropical sandbars was eventually pushed to its absolute structural limits.
Because the search for the Northwest Passage required them to leave the tropics and enter the Arctic.
Right. In 1778, the expedition pushed north through the Bering Strait.
They reached an extreme latitude of 70 degrees 44 minutes north.
And at that point, they encountered a solid, impenetrable wall of pack ice.
The kinetic energy of navigating through heavy pack ice is just terrifying.
The floating ice blocks slam against the hull with massive force.
And this is where that secondary layer of sacrificial planking, the doubling, served a dual purpose.
It absorbed the crushing impact of the ice, protecting the primary hull beneath.
But even with that reinforcement, the sheer violence of the Arctic gales shattered their rigging.
It battered the ships until they actually began taking on water. The Northwest Passage was blocked, the season was turning, and they were forced to retreat south.
To repair the vessels in Kealakekua Bay, Hawaii.
The transition from the environmental hostility of the Arctic to the complex sociopolitical environment of Hawaii, that's where the narrative shifts from structural survival to human tragedy.
We tend to view massive historical events as the result of grand, sweeping geopolitical forces. But the logs from the Discovery illustrate how catastrophic outcomes often cascade from incredibly localized, almost mundane altercations.
Yeah, the breakdown in relations didn't start with a massive battle. It started with a missing piece of hardware.
On February 13th, 1779, a Hawaiian man took a set of armorer's tools from the Discovery and fled in a canoe.
And in the context of the expedition, iron tools were invaluable. You can't just forge a new set of precision tools on a tropical beach.
No, you can't. So the master of the Discovery, Thomas Edgar, alongside a 19-year-old midshipman, immediately pursued the man ashore to retrieve the stolen hardware.
And that 19-year-old midshipman was George Vancouver.
The same Vancouver who would later command his own historic expeditions to map the Pacific Northwest.
Yes, But in that specific moment, he was just a junior officer thrust into a rapidly escalating physical confrontation.
The pursuit leads to this chaotic scuffle on the beach. Thomas Edgar gets physically backed onto a rock by the crowd.
A Hawaiian man swings a broken oar directly at Edgar's head.
But Vancouver throws himself into the trajectory of the weapon.
He takes the blunt force of the blow to his own side and is knocked to the ground.
He essentially absorbs the impact to save his superior officer.
Wow.
But this raises an important question about how the physical violence of that specific altercation completely shattered the fragile diplomatic equilibrium in the Bay.
Because the underlying cultural misunderstandings were already immense.
Yes. And that scuffle just catalyzed the tension. Under the cover of darkness that same night, the situation escalated from a dispute over tools to a critical logistical threat.
The Discovery's large cutter boat was stolen.
And the loss of the cutter is the tipping point. The cutter wasn't just a rowboat. It was a heavy-duty vessel essential for moving massive anchors,
Ferrying large quantities of supplies, managing the deep water operations of the ship.
Without it, the ship's operational capacity is severely crippled.
So Cook's reaction to this theft was to employ a tactic he had used successfully on previous voyages. He would go ashore, take the highest-ranking local chief hostage, and hold him until the stolen property was returned.
It was a standard, albeit deeply coercive, protocol for the expedition. But applying that tactic in Kealakekua Bay, amid an already highly agitated population and complex local power dynamics,
It was a fatal miscalculation.
completely fatal. On the morning of February 14th, Cook lands on the beach with a detachment of Marines. He attempts to march the High Chief back to the boats.
The crowd realizes what is happening and surges forward to protect their leader.
Panic sets in. A musket shot is fired.
And in the ensuing chaotic melee in the surf, James Cook is struck down and killed.
The death of James Cook sent an immediate shockwave through the global scientific community. But on the ground, it triggered a desperate reorganization of command.
The dying Charles Clerk was forced to transfer from the Discovery to take overall command of the expedition on the Resolution.
Leaving Lieutenant John Gore to be promoted to command the Discovery.
And Clerk, his lungs completely failing from the tuberculosis he contracted in that London debtor's prison, he led the expedition back north for one final, agonizingly futile attempt at the ice wall.
He finally succumbed to the disease near Kamchatka.
The battered, exhausted remnants of the expedition, having lost both their visionary leader and his successor, finally navigated the Discovery back into the River Thames in October of 1780.
And this return marks the beginning of a bizarre historiographical distortion regarding the Discovery's ultimate fate.
Oh, the myth.
Yes, the myth. If you consult popular historical accounts from the 19th and early 20th centuries, you will find this persistent urban legend that this legendary vessel was stripped of its dignity and reduced to a rotting convict prison hulk moored on the Thames.
It's a deeply cynical narrative, right? The idea that a ship that mapped the Pacific and survived the Arctic was left to rot as a floating jail cell.
And this entire myth was heavily popularized by a famous 1828 etching by the maritime artist Edward William Cook.
The etching vividly depicts a decaying, grim prison ship, explicitly labeled as Captain Cook's Discovery.
The etching is a masterpiece of maritime art, but it is historically inaccurate. Cook painted the entirely wrong ship.
Which is mind-blowing. The archival records from the naval dockyards prove this conclusively. The prison hulk in that 1828 etching was indeed named HMS Discovery, but it was a completely different vessel launched in 1789.
And in a brilliant twist of historical irony, that 1789 Discovery was the exact ship commanded by George Vancouver.
The same man who took an oar to the ribs in Hawaii.
Yes, when he returned to meticulously map the Pacific Northwest.
So what was the actual bureaucratic reality of the 1774 Discovery?
It's far more practical and arguably more respectful of its design. It was never a prison. Following its return in 1780, the Navy converted it into a transport vessel,
utilizing that exact same shallow draft and massive cargo capacity to haul supplies during the American War of Independence.
It later transitioned into a dockyard craft at Woolwich, essentially operating as a heavy-duty harbor workhorse.
Until it was finally decommissioned and meticulously broken up for scrap timber at Chatham in 1797.
It lived its entire life cycle doing exactly what it was engineered to do in Whitby, carrying heavy loads and surviving brutal conditions.
So what does this all mean? Why should you care about the administrative life cycle and structural physics of a wooden coal ship from 1774?
Well, I think it's because this specific vessel fundamentally redefines our concept of what an exploration vehicle looks like.
Yes. The lineage of Discovery isn't built on glamorous, sleek aesthetics. It is built on pure, unyielding resilience.
The ability to absorb an impact, to sit grounded on a sandbar without shattering, and to utilize every square inch of available space for applied science.
And that specific brand of resilience became deeply embedded in the culture of exploration. The name itself became a talisman.
When Robert Falcon Scott launched his harrowing expedition to the Antarctic in 1901, he demanded his ship be named Discovery.
And when NASA engineers were finalizing the name for their third operational spaceworthy shuttle, the vehicle tasked with deploying the Hubble Space Telescope and pushing human presence further into the vacuum, they didn't pull a name out of thin air.
They deliberately selected Discovery to honor this specific 1774 Whitby Cat.
A ship that began its life hauling dirt and coal down the English coast ultimately provided the name for humanity's most sophisticated leaps into the stars.
It really forces a profound recalibration of how we view the technology around us today.
How so?
Well, if a deeply unglamorous, flat-bottomed commercial coal hauler from the 18th century could possess the exact structural properties required to map the globe and eventually lend its name to a spacecraft, what mundane, completely everyday commercial tools or technologies currently sitting in our driveways, our shipping yards, or our warehouses might be remembered centuries from now?
Oh, that's a brilliant thought.
What entirely ordinary piece of commercial machinery today will be retrofitted, pushed to its limits, and remembered as the literal vessel of our era's greatest yet-to-be-made discoveries?